How many running backs can finish as the overall RB1? We will discuss what it takes to be the overall RB1 and more on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 that you can bet on anything from the Summer Olympics to who's going to hit one out of the park in your favorite MLB games. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also read her at Pro Football Focus and Behind the Steel Curtain. On today's show, we are discussing how many running backs can finish as the overall RB1 this season. We'll take a look at the favorites, some sleepers. But Kate, I want to first get into what type of production is needed on a yearly basis to be the overall RB1. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey's done that the last couple of years. We've had Josh Jacobs, who was pretty close. Was that back in 2022, I believe now? What type of numbers are we looking for here?
Volume, Marcus. That's the number that we want to pay attention to when we are identifying potential RB1s on the season. Now, let's just look at the average stat line. So we took a look back all the way dating back to 2014, the last 10 NFL seasons, to identify the averages for the overall RB1. 22 fantasy points per game. These running backs average 368 opportunities per season. Now, that's a lot of opportunities. So that accounts for both touches, including like receptions, but also includes like targets. So, maybe targets that weren't converted. So looking at total rush attempts plus targets, average 92 targets per season, almost 2,000 scrimmage yards and 17 touchdowns. So what we're looking at is A, the potential for volume, and B, the potential for scoring upside. So it's really hard to identify a potential candidate for the overall RB1 if they don't have both the opportunity for volume and some high upside in terms of scoring. So we want to find those workhorse running backs on good offenses, which I know it seems kind of like simple, like duh, that's what we're looking for. But that's the recipe that we're looking for when we're identifying every year's RB1.
The general rule of thumb has been, at least for the last 2 decades playing fantasy football, is this running back needs to average about 21 to 22 touches a game. Now, it can be certainly more than that, and we've seen plenty of running backs average more than that, but that's 21 is basically like the cutoff. It's almost impossible to do it if you're getting fewer touches than that, unless you are just so efficient. But it's pretty unlikely that if you're being that efficient, you're not going to just get more work. And there's only so many running backs in the league, Kate, that are given that much of a workload game in and game out. And that's why the list here that we're going to get to in a little bit is relatively small. There's just not a lot of teams, first of all, that have a player that's capable of handling that workload. And most teams have shifted to a running back by committee backfield. And you're seeing 2 and 3 running backs get that amount of touches. So it's not a surprise that, there's only 4 or 5 true contenders year in and year out for this prestigious spot.
Absolutely. Let's look back at some of the recent RB1 finishers in fantasy points per game. Again, minimum 12 games played. Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler in 2022, Jonathan Taylor, Dalvin Cook, Christian McCaffrey. Again, I will say he's the only player over the last 10 years that did this on 2 different offenses, which, Christian McCaffrey, # very good at football. But you see a lot of repeaters year to year. Le'Veon Bell repeated between the 2015 and 2016. Todd Gurley repeated 2017, 2018. Christian McCaffrey repeated. So it wouldn't be a surprise if we saw one of these names pop up once again. I would be surprised if it were Todd Gurley or Le'Veon Bell, but like Christian McCaffrey, yeah, like that seems well within the realm of possibility. But I think what is probably most important now is just that scoring potential, that high upside offense, just because of the fact that, yeah, as you alluded to, teams are sort of navigating away from this, workhorse running back and navigating more toward a running back by committee. But in each of the last 10 years, Marcus, there was only one player who accomplished this feat that had fewer than 250 rush attempts on a season. That was Austin Eckler in 2022. He had 204 rush attempts. He was also the only player to have fewer than 1,000 rushing yards, but he made up for that in a big way, both with targets, had 127 targets. That was the second most among any RB1 season in the last 10 years. And then he also made up for it with touchdowns, with 18 total touchdowns between the ground and the air. So
and if you're looking at that list, Kate, as well, if you don't mind putting that back up, if you're watching with us on YouTube, he had the lowest amount of rushing yards, and he happened to be the one of these 10 running backs, the one that averaged the fewest amount of fantasy points per game. Now, it just happened to be a little bit of a down year for running backs. I wonder, like, if that season happened in 2024, if that's, maybe the RB4 rather than the RB1. I mean, 18.1 points per game in half point PPR for your overall RB1 suggests that it was kind of a down year for running backs.
Yeah, down year in general. And I mean, that's kind of the case for most of these seasons that we've seen in recent years. Now, most, RB1 seasons have come with 22 or more fantasy points. And again, looking at the opportunity for rushing attempts per game, targets, I found to be a fascinating metric. Not a single one of the overall RB1s on a season over the past 10 years had fewer than 50 targets. All but two of them had more than 80. So I think targets, and this is in half PPR scoring formats, targets are going to be a big indicator of opportunity. The average number of targets for the overall RB1 over the past 10 years, again, 92 targets average across the RB1. So when we're thinking about, who really has RB1 upside, again, it's going to be these volume players. It's going to be good offenses, but it's also most often these guys that have carved out a role for themselves in the passing game. So some of these more one-dimensional players, we can kind of count them out.
And one final thought here. Again, if you're watching with us on YouTube, you can see the yearly finishers as the RB1. All of these teams had a winning record, except for the Panthers in 2019. Christian McCaffrey went bonkers. The Panthers actually finished last in the NFC South. It just shows you what a special talent McCaffrey is. I mean, it's very simple, but if you're on a bad team, you probably aren't going to get enough opportunities to score the touchdowns. It's going to help you ultimately rise among your peers. So you better be taking a running back that's in a pretty good offense on a pretty good team, because like this year, Christian McCaffrey, the 49ers, they were the number 1 seed. Le'Veon Bell and the Steelers back in 2016, they were either the 1 or 2 seed. Todd Gurley with the Rams, the 1 or 2 seed. Austin Eckler, the Chargers made the playoffs that year with Justin Herbert. So when we get to some of these sleepers later on, you can tell yourself a story about how they're going to potentially be the RB1. But if their overall team is not that good, it's pretty unlikely that it's going to happen.
Very fair.
All right, let's talk about some players who are absolute locks to be contenders for the RB1 this year. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, not the NBA Finals. The NBA Finals are over now, so we've got to wait for a while. But the good thing is, on FanDuel, they have everything to bet on right now. You can bet on golf. Obviously, we've got baseball. We've got the Summer Olympics coming up in a little bit. And if you're an NFL fan, like Kate and I are, you can start looking at some player props, some futures bets. Go check out the MVP awards. A lot of good stuff over at FanDuel. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 that you can use to bet on everything from the NFL MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary streaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Kate, let's transition over to some running backs that are no doubt locks to be in contention for the overall RB1. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey headlines that list, but who else do we got?
We've got to just ignore Christian McCaffrey, of course, because yada, yada, yada. We know he can do it. But I do think that there are a number of other running backs who, even in this modern era of, the workhorse by committee type of role, I think there are several names that can fit the bill. So first up, I want to talk about Bijan Robinson. Then we've got Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor, and Saquon Barkley. Now, I feel a little bit more strongly about these than others, but if I have to pick one guy out of this group, it's going to be Bijan Robinson, who probably had the most underrated rookie season. And I think it just comes from the overall frustration with Arthur Smith, the goal line usage. He had 300 total opportunities as a rookie, including rush attempts and targets. He was tied for the second most targets among all running backs, only behind Breece Hall. I mean, let's be real. For a guy who had nearly 1,500 scrimmage yards and 8 touchdowns, the consensus was pretty down on him. And you're looking at his position and, obviously Jahmyr Gibbs, the Lions, they have a good offense, but I would say the Atlanta Falcons are right up there and projecting for one of the best offenses among any of these running backs on the list.
Yeah, Bijan is the easy name for me here. I mean, he's my RB1 right now in Dynasty. So, of course, I think he can finish as the overall RB1. I think of this group, he's just the most talented. He's the youngest. I think he's playing behind arguably the best offensive line. I think the Atlanta's offensive line is fairly close to Detroit and Philadelphia's, that we can have a debate about it. But I just think he's the best all-around player in terms of what he can do as a runner, how dynamic he is as a receiver. He's the one that I'm betting on if I'm taking somebody else than Christian McCaffrey to finish as the RB1. But Kate, of these next 4 names that you have listed here on the screen, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, which one do you like the next best to finish as the RB1?
For me, it's probably going to be Saquon Barkley, and that's kind of crazy because he's got some question marks. He's coming into this really good Philadelphia Eagles offense, even though it sputtered out in the second half of the last season. But there should be a lot of opportunity here. There should be a lot of opportunity to score. He's playing alongside a very proficient rushing quarterback, which is conducive to fantasy points. But Jonathan Taylor playing in a pretty similar situation overall, but I'm just going to trust the Philadelphia offense. And I'm also going to trust the opportunities for goal line work with Saquon Barkley. I just think they're a better offense overall.
Yeah, and we know how talented Saquon is. We know how good that offensive line is. And one of the positive things is that Kellen Moore, who is the new offensive coordinator with the Eagles, at least when he was with Dallas, the Cowboys were always at the very top of the league in terms of carries inside the 5-yard line. Now, the tricky thing is, are those carries going to go to Jalen Hurts or are they going to go to Saquon Barkley? That remains to be seen. But Kate, my next question for you here, with all these names, McCaffrey, Bijan, Gibbs, Hall, Taylor, Barkley, Which of these do you feel the least confident could finish as an RB1?
I think, and this is going to feel a little bit crazy, I'm probably going to go with Jahmyr Gibbs here, who I absolutely love as a talent. I have him as my RB3 ranked in Dynasty right now. And I mean, you look at the opportunities, right? The Detroit Lions ranked second in the league in terms of running back rush attempts last year, 449 total rush attempts at the running back position as a team. The opportunity is going to be there, but I do still have questions. So the common theme when we're looking at these RB1s is volume. And I don't think that, while he projects for a ton of volume, maybe we want to project an increased role in the receiving game. I don't think they're going to entirely neglect David Montgomery, which is my biggest concern in terms of Jahmyr Gibbs' upside. Last year, David Montgomery dealt with some health issues. He wasn't fully healthy around midseason. Then we started to see Jahmyr Gibbs, take an uptick in work. But if David Montgomery does come in fully healthy this season, what are the chances that they do split more work than you would like to be conducive for an RB1 season?
I mean, David Montgomery is just the best backup running back of all these teams that we have listed here. And he should play. Like, he gives Detroit an identity of some tough inside running. They obviously trust him near the goal line as well. Now, I think, obviously, we think Gibbs is going to outscore Montgomery, but there's going to be probably, what do you say, 4 or 5 weeks where Montgomery outscores Gibbs, and that's probably going to be enough to take him out of the overall RB1 conversation. It doesn't mean that we don't think Gibbs is going to finish as a top 5 and maybe even a top 3 running back, but I think Montgomery is established and competent enough to just be a little bit annoying to the Jahmyr Gibbs dynasty.
He's going to be very annoying.
Yeah.
I think that's the right word for him because he's just talented enough. He's by far the best backup, and I think the biggest threat to a consistent workload because he's not just relegated to the backup role, right? He is a true change of pace back that gets consistent touches even when Jahmyr Gibbs is healthy. So that's kind of the biggest barrier. Even if end of season Jahmyr Gibbs has that top 3 RB upside, it's just, is it enough to get to RB1? Yep. Then let's talk about the biggest dart throw here on this list, which I think we'd both probably agree is Breece Hall.
Yeah.
We know there's a ton of upside there. Lost some efficiency in his return from the ACL injury, which I don't think anybody, that wasn't a surprise to anybody necessarily, but I think the biggest wild card is what does this offense look like? And is this actually a good offense? Because you have an old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury. The skill position players, I mean, you could easily name 15 other, skill position groups in the league that are better than the Jets, even though they're building like this contending roster. You have Mike Williams coming off an ACL injury. You have Malachi Corley, who we really like, but I think he's going to be more of a gimmicky player that they have to figure out how to use. And I don't know that I trust Nathaniel Hackett to do it. Like, what does this offense realistically look like? And that's my biggest question for Breece Hall, even though I think he projects for a ton of volume.
Yeah, I will say that they did improve the offensive line, which makes me feel much better about Breece Hall's situation. He's going into year 3. They added Tyron Smith. They added Morgan Moses. They drafted Olaf Ashanu. Like, that offensive line should be significantly better than it was last year. And even if Aaron Rodgers is only 75% of himself, that's going to be so much better than what we saw from Zach Wilson and every other quarterback that started last year, which means lighter boxes, more touchdown opportunities. I believe Breece Hall only had 2 carries inside the 5-yard line last year. And I think that's the thing that could flip here, right? Like, he could go from 2 carries in 2023 to 22 carries inside the 5-yard line if this offense is as good as I think everybody is maybe anticipating. So
the Jets ranked dead last in terms of goal line plays. They only had 15 total goal line plays the entire season. Now, the Dallas Cowboys, for comparison, 77 to the Jets, 15.
And I don't expect there to be 77, but could we see 45? I think that's very, very realistic. All right, okay, let's get into some sleepers because this is what you all came here for. This is what you wanted to listen to, is which sleepers that are being drafted outside the top 5 or 6 running backs could finish as the overall RB1. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. Everydayers. On tomorrow's show, we're going to look at the wide receivers. How many wide receivers can finish as the wide receiver one? What does it take to finish as the wide receiver one? We will be discussing that on Wednesday's show, so make sure you tune in for that. But, Kate, let's get to some sleepers. Which players that are being drafted outside the top 5 or 6 running backs right now have a realistic chance as finishing as the overall RB1?
Now, this list, this is how we're going to kind of go about this list, Marcus. We have compiled a group of players that we think could hit that bill, whether it be, a bell cow role in a really good offense, whether it be the potential to have 300 plus touches in a season, the scoring upside. We've taken all those factors and we said, who could possibly fit in this realm? And this is the group of players we came up with here. Kyren Williams, Travis Etienne, Derrick Henry, James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, and the biggest kicker of them all, Zamir White, who I'm actually surprisingly more on board with than I thought I would be heading into the show doing my research. Let's start with Kyren Williams because, Kyren Williams, hashtag good at football. But the biggest question mark remains. He had a spring program where he was dealing with an injury. He's dealt with injuries in the past. Missed several games last season, which is why he only played 12, which made all of his production, way more remarkable. But last year, he led all running backs with 19 rush attempts per game, averaged just over 5 yards per carry, 95 rushing yards per game, 12 rushing touchdowns in his 12-game play. But with the injury, does he still have this RB1 upside with that history and the fact that they just drafted Blake Corum? And I think the goal of drafting Blake Corum was so that they don't have to give him 20 plus touches a game.
I think that was the idea. We'll see how Sean McVay actually does with that, because what he typically does is he falls in love with one running back and then he just doesn't take them off the field. And we're not predicting that Kyren Williams is going to be able to stay healthy for 16 or 17 games. But if he does, like if I told you right now, Kate, that Kyren Williams is playing all 17 games, he would be a lock to be a top 5 running back this year, correct?
I think so.
He's just on an offense that's really good, that has a ton of goal line opportunities. Sean McVay loves to run the ball inside the 5-yard line. So that one is an easy one to me. The one that I really wanted to mention here is James Cook. We saw in the second half of the season, once Joe Brady became the offensive coordinator for the Bills, James Cook was putting up RB1 numbers and like high-end RB1 numbers. Now, they did draft Ray Davis, but that wasn't until day 3. Damian Harris retired. They didn't bring back Leonard Fournette. James Cook is just the clear-cut best running back of this team. And you can make the argument he's the most established skill player that the Bills have in their roster right now. I think he could get a lot of work. It wouldn't surprise me, Kate, if he led the Bills in receptions this year as well. Like he gets 70, 75 catches. And now we're talking about somebody who, 225, 250 carries, 75 receptions, and he hits that 20-ish opportunities a game that we need for that RB1.
Yeah, and looking at his opportunities in the second half of the season, week 10 onward, average just over 16 attempts per game, just over 3.5 targets per game. So that's getting us right around to that 20 opportunities per game mark that is interesting. The biggest question for me just comes from kind of like, what does this Bills offense look like without Stephon Diggs? I do think they're going to be a little bit more widespread. I think they're going to, heavily utilize Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, shots down the field to Keon Coleman, but that could project if Josh Allen is willing to use his running back a little bit more in the passing game as opposed to running. That could be big for James Cook. The biggest maybe potential value here is Derrick Henry, of course, who finally gets his opportunity to run alongside Lamar Jackson. Now, the biggest question, the range of possibilities, I think, is tremendous for Derrick Henry because he's coming off a season where, still old, ranked 5th in total scrimmage touches last year. He wasn't even on a good offense, put up nearly 1,200 scrimmage yard or 1,200 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns. Everything kind of trended up for Derrick Henry, but there's that threat of Lamar Jackson, especially around the goal line, that kind of holds you back. Let's talk about Travis Etienne real quick, because I think Travis Etienne, also a very interesting name. He ranked third among running backs in total touches last year, 325 touches from scrimmage in the regular season. Wasn't efficient with those touches. So that's a big question mark. 3.78 yards per carry from Travis Etienne. You also had the Jaguars, who ranked second lowest in terms of PFF run blocking grade. Is this offensive line going to be any better? Because if not, then Travis Etienne, yeah, he might have 320 plus touches, but will they mean anything?
The hope is that with Cam Robinson not dealing with a suspension now, they drafted Anton Harrison in the first round last year. Maybe he'll take a step up in year 2. We'll see. I'm optimistic about the Jags offensive line, but it's just another case where I just think he's so much better than every other running back on the roster, including Tank Bigsby, that he just might be in a situation where he gets a ton of work. So that one's interesting to me. Can we go to the bottom of this list, Kate, and talk about Zamir White? Because that's the one I think most people that are watching or listening to us right now,
they're laughing.
I was going to say, I think they could understand really sound arguments for Kyron, Etienne, Henry, Cook, Jacobs, Walker, especially Jacobs. Jacobs basically did it in 2022 when he led the NFL in rushing yards and yards from scrimmage. But Zamir White, this is not projected to be a great offense. Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew is going to be the quarterback there. Why is he on the list?
He's on the list from a volume standpoint. And what I think is very interesting about Zamir White, and they kind of, the Raiders had talked about what are they going to do once Josh Jacobs leaves this team, right? And the consensus was, we're going to go with a running back by committee. But when you look at the committee that they're putting together, Zamir White, I think, is the only guy that kind of fits the bill as a true first and second down option for the Raiders. They drafted Dylan Lobby, in the 6th round. He was one of the best receiving backs coming out of this year's class. But I don't think anybody's going to make the argument about him as a pure rusher. Last year, when Zamir White had the opportunity, had 4 starts without Josh Jacobs in the mix, and he averaged 21 carries per game, 3.3 targets per game. From a volume standpoint, it's really, really hard to find that, right? And you look at a 17-game pace in that span, the scoring opportunities weren't plentiful, only had 1 touchdown over those 4 starts, but he was on pace for 357 rush attempts, almost 1,700 rushing yards, 255 receiving yards. That's approaching that 2,000-yard mark that we're saying. And you look at the way that the Raiders seemingly want to structure their offense, it kind of makes sense that it's going to be built around the run game. And Zamir White's the only guy I think is really the threat to do it.
I actually have no doubts that he's going to approach 20 opportunities per game with the Raiders.
No doubt.
I'm
confident.
My concern is the touchdowns. Because I could see him being, 1,700 total yards and 7 touchdowns, because I just don't know how often the Raiders are going to be in the red zone unless one of these quarterbacks is just way better than anybody anticipates. And obviously I think the Raiders are hoping that it's Aiden O'Connell, that he makes a big leap in year 2, but he's locked into a really strong workload on an offensive line that I think is going to be significantly better this year. You're hoping with the addition of Brock Bowers that maybe they have more red zone opportunities. But yeah, he's going to get fed. Antonio Pierce is dead set on giving Zamir White a ton of touches this year. So I'm buying. I really am.
Last year, weeks 11 through 18, the Raiders ranked 24th in total red zone plays. And as you alluded to, 27th in terms of goal line plays. That's not great, but I honestly still don't know that we can really picture what this offense is going to look like just yet.
Fair.
If it's Gardner Minshew, let's say, you have Brock Bowers, you have Devontae. I think Gardner Minshew, an average quarterback, and we saw the Colts offense be productive with him in the system. let's say it's Gardner Minshew, I would feel a little bit more comfortable probably about drafting Zamir White. But regardless, I don't think this offense seems as bad in my head as it feels
I
in
hope
my
not.
heart between, Devontae Adams, Michael Mayer, Brock Bowers. Like, they have some weapons.
Michael Gallup, they signed. So, I mean, they are pretty talented at the skill position spot. They just need to get average quarterback play. And if they can do that, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Zamir White is in that conversation.
Whew.
That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.